Hello there and welcome to my ultimate guide to the Dragoon in Final Fantasy XIV. In this video I will be covering the job niche and overall fantasy of the Dragoon, Dragon Gauge, Blood of the Dragon, Life of the Dragon, and, well, if we're being honest, everything of the Dragon. After that we're going to go into the rotation fundamentals and then follow that up with utility abilities, openers, and then we're going to wrap up that section of the guide talking about handy macros. Next up, after that, we are going to talk about my personal review of the Dragoon, going into pros, cons, and then a final personal rating. So starting off with the niche and the fantasy of the Dragoon's entire kit is completely infused with the idea of dragons and jumping around the battlefield, making it one of the most mobile melee jobs in the entire game. With abilities like Blood of the Dragon, Dragon Sight, Dragonfire Dive, and a kit deeply interwoven in some of the most fundamental lore of the game's Heavensward expansion, there's absolutely no denying that the Dragoon's flavor for dragons is, well, it's very much there. The Dragoon also features a deep rotation dragon life cycle, where the Dragoon goes through the life cycles of Blood of the Dragon into Life of the Dragon to unleash devastating combos onto foes. One of the key features of the Dragoon's kit is that its rotation is deeply interwoven into maximizing the time between global cooldowns, with significant chunks of the kit dedicated to purely off-global cooldown rotations. This makes the Dragoon very unique in that its off-global cooldowns are actually very carefully weaved and form an intricate rotation in parallel to your global cooldown rotation, making the Dragoon one of my top picks for players looking for minimal downtime between global cooldowns in this game. But further than that, the Dragoon also makes its mark as an extremely powerful utility DPS, bringing Eye of the Dragon and Battle Litany, dramatically increasing the party's output potential, and at the time of writing the script, securing it a spot as one of the most powerful DPS in the entire game. So if you like buffing allies, jumping around the battlefield, and dragons, there's no doubting that you're gonna feel at home on the Dragoon. So let's jump right into the Dragon Gauge. Blood of the Dragon, Life of the Dragon, and everything of the Dragon, basically. In this section, I'll start by talking about the Dragon Gauge, because ultimately this underpins the entire goals of the kit as the rotation truly evolves over the course of a fight, and this evolution is visually represented through this Dragon Gauge. At level 52, you will learn an ability called Blood of the Dragon. This is a self-buff shown on the gauge. The buff lasts 30 total seconds. The main thing is that you always want to have Blood of the Dragon buff applied to yourself, as this unlocks core parts of the rest of your kit that are otherwise blocked off. Ideally, you should never let it fall off, and if you are ever at risk of it falling off, you can simply recast the Blood of the Dragon ability and it will reset the duration to 30 seconds. So you have a 5-second window of forgiveness, so make use of this, as the cooldown of the Blood of the Dragon ability is only 25 seconds. And there are no real drawbacks outside of you dying and needing to apply the buff from popping this ability, so make sure to use it liberally. This is extremely handy for when you have a slow tank between pulls and you don't want to lose this buff. However, outside of manually pressing the Blood of the Dragon to refresh the duration, certain abilities are going to extend the duration of this Blood of the Dragon buff themselves. I will quickly list them out here, but they will be explained in more detail in the rotation section. First off, we have Wheeling Thrust that increases the duration by 10 seconds. Next up, Fang and Claw gives a 10-second duration increase. Sonic Thrust will increase the duration by 10 seconds as well. And lastly, Coerth and Torment will increase the duration by 10 seconds as well. It should be noted, however, that the maximum duration that you can have of Blood of the Dragon is 30 seconds at cap. You can't overshoot it to, say, 40 or 50. So what exactly do you get from maintaining this Blood of the Dragon buff? A whole host of things, and so we're going to break it apart chunk by chunk here. First off, you can cast the abilities Wheeling Thrust and Fang and Claw. Yes, the same abilities that extend the duration by 10 seconds. These are actually extremely critical pieces of your single target rotation, dealing very heavy damage and leading into a further heavy damaging ability called Ride and Thrust at the end. But we're going to get that in the rotation section. However, all three of these abilities are very core to every single rotation that you're going to do, and so making sure that the buff is critical even just to your basic fundamental rotation. However, you're also going to gain access to the GEIRSKOGUL ability, that is a potent area of effect cone in front of your character. This is especially critical as it is off of the global cooldown, and so it can be weaved in between global cooldowns. This ability is available once every 30 seconds. Next up, we need to talk about the eye. The gauge also has a very critical eye on it, and this is called the gaze of the Dragon Gauge. This eye has 3 stages: closed, slightly open, and fully open. These states act the exact same way no matter what life cycle of the dragon that you're in. Red bar, blue bar, it's all the same. Now let's talk about the jump ability. The Dragoon has the jump or high jump ability, which is obtained once the Dragoon levels up high enough to upgrade the jump ability. However, for consistency's sake, I'm just going to be calling it jump from here on out. But if you hear some people call it jump or high jump, it really is interchangeable. Most people still call it jump, even though the ability name has upgraded, so I'm just going to call it jump. And so this jump acts in a way that might surprise some people, if I'm being honest, because it is actually going to return the Dragoon to the exact position that they cast the high jump ability at. Due to it being off of the global cooldown and hitting decently hard, you're going to want to weave this in between global cooldowns as expected, and with a relatively low 30-second cooldown, you're going to have this up quite frequently. But this ability is unique in that it is going to unlock the special ability Mirage Dive. That is another off global cooldown to weave in between your core rotation abilities, and this also hits decently hard itself. But the trick is that Mirage Dive is going to open the eye to the next stage once used. So we start with a closed eye, I use jump, which then unlocked Mirage Dive. I then use Mirage Dive, and now the eye is half open. I then jump again when it's off cooldown, I get Mirage Dive again, and now the eye is fully open. So in effect, every 30 seconds you get an off global cooldown 1-2 rotation of jump into Mirage Dive, and then once every minute, or 2 iterations of this jump Mirage Dive rotation, you'll get a fully opened eye. Remember how earlier I was talking about the off global cooldown ability GEIRSKOGUL? Now that is actually going to be extremely critical here, and this ability changes when you have a fully opened eye. The Dragoon, as I said when I started talking about the gauge, has 2 sort of dragon life cycles, Blood of the Dragon and then Life of the Dragon. Life of the Dragon phase is only accessible when you have the eye fully opened and then you use the GEIRSKOGUL ability. This will immediately give you a 30-second duration red bar on your dragon gauge, and that will unlock 2 special skills to weave in off the global cooldown. This 30-second phase with the red bar is called Life of the Dragon. Firstly, the same keybind for GEIRSKOGUL will now become an ability called Nastrond. Nastrond is basically an enhanced GEIRSKOGUL, dealing area of effect damage in front of the Dragoon, just the same as GEIRSKOGUL, but Nastrond hits significantly harder, and Nastrond has a very, very low 10-second cooldown timer, so it's a very huge DPS boost. Another perk to remember is now how we had to cast GEIRSKOGUL to even enter Life of the Dragon lifecycle phase. Nastrond is available immediately for use after GEIRSKOGUL. So given that we have 10 seconds of cooldown time on Nastrond and then 30-second duration on the Life of the Dragon window, means that you can fit in 3 Nastrond off of the global cooldown. Now let's talk about the ultimate finisher of this Life of a Dragon phase, Stardiver. Stardiver is yet another off global cooldown ability that deals tremendously large damage to the target and all enemies around it, and unlike the jump ability, will actually relocate the Dragoon's positioning completely to be beside the main target of the ability. I like to think of these dragon life cycles as almost a circular pattern of 1-minute intervals, where you enter the circle by using your first jump followed by a Mirage Dive and GEIRSKOGUL, and then at the 30-second mark you use your second jump Mirage Dive combo, unlocking the Life of Dragon phase and blow into the Life of Dragon phase using GEIRSKOGUL, where you're going to throw out your Nastrond and Stardiver abilities that are newly unlocked with this phase change. Likewise, from saying all of that, it's probably become quite clear that the Dragoon has massively core parts of their kit's rotation buried in between, weaving off global cooldowns between their primary rotation. But what is on that main global cooldown rotation exactly is probably what most people are wondering, and this here is where the so-called dreaded positionals of the Dragoon come into play. But before you get worried at the mention of positionals, I have some personal tips and tricks for the hotbar layout that I will explain that actually makes it extremely easy to understand and always remember. And when people say that, sometimes they don't really mean it, but I mean it. As soon as you get these down, it'll be really easy and make a lot of sense too. But starting with the rotation, I'm going to break this rotation down into 2 different components. I call the first the back positioning, or taking the enemy from behind. Once you assume the position at the back side of the target, you will start your rotation by using True Thrust into Disembowel into Chaos Thrust. Whew, that's a lot of thrusting from behind. But it should be stated very clearly though that the only ability that gains a potency boost from attacking from behind is actually the Chaos Thrust ability, which results in a 40 potency increase. Chaos Thrust is also a very important ability to keep your eye on, as it will apply a very heavy hitting damage over time effect onto the target, but as you'll see very soon, the way the Dragoon's rotation flows, you will very rarely find yourself needing to really pay attention to the duration of this damage over time effect if you do the rotation properly. And one more thing that should be noted before we move forward is that the disembowel ability of this rotation also gives you opponent self buff of 10% more damage for 30 seconds duration. But similar to the damage over time effect of Chaos Thrust, this isn't something that I really can say that you need to ever really be directly worried about. If you do your rotation properly, this buff will always be refreshed and needs no micromanagement. The second rotation I call the side position. Like one of those Christian side hugs that you hear about so much in memes, you start off with the same true thrust ability and then work it into vorpal thrust and then full thrust. I mean, no one said just because it's a Christian side hug that there can't be thrusting. Maybe I should change the opener of the Dragoon to state that they are the masters of dragons, buffs, jumps, and thrusting. Missed opportunity. But back to the side hug rotation. Unlike the first rotation, this one actually has no positionals. Now you're probably disappointed and wonder why I brought up the side hug, and that's because there are two components that kind of come into play later on when you unlock Blood of the Dragon. And if you remember, I mentioned that buff earlier. That's going to be the 30-second duration buff that you want to keep up all the time. And earlier on, I mentioned the abilities Wheeling Thrust and Fang and Claw, and then Ride and Thrust. These two basic rotations are further built upon with these abilities to make one solid fluid circle of rotation that flows from one end to the other. After Chaos Thrust, you will now add Wheeling Thrust that gains a potency boost when cast from behind the target. And after Full Thrust, you'll gain access to Fang and Claw, which is going to gain a potency boost from the side of the target. And that's why I call the side rotation, because eventually you're really going to need to be there for this, and I think that it makes sense to just logically move yourself in that direction. Now these two abilities do have some interplay with one another. After casting Chaos Thrust, you then unlock Wheeling Thrust, and so in reality, the rotation really does do a major loop at this point of the rotation between Wheeling Thrust and Fang and Claw. And this is also probably the trickiest part of the positionals, because you either need to rapidly move from side to back or back to side of the target between these two abilities. But don't worry, I have you covered on how I personally handle that in the tips and tricks section. Now, properly doing these abilities upgrades your basic true thrust into an ability called Ride and Thrust, which is going to ultimately result in just a potency increase of 40. It's not going to behave differently, it's not going to have some added effect, it's just a 40 potency increase. But the trick is that you need to do the Fang and Claw and Wheeling Thrust properly with your positionals in order to unlock Ride and Thrust. Ultimately, this leads into the side rotation, moving fluently into the back rotation, and vice versa, forming a nice happy complete circle. And now that forms your entire on global cooldown rotation. But before I move on, I did mention a trick to keep yourself all lined up for positionals. People can and will of course disagree with me or have their own opinion, and that's totally okay. But what I have personally found works best for me is that we're going to set the true thrust to be my baseline ability, then I keep my backside on my bottom bar, oh yes, I then keep my side hug rotation to my upper bar, and this makes it so that if I ever really forgot which ability goes where, then I can just look at my bar instantly and I know, oh, it's on the bottom, so I go to the backside of the enemy. Now I want to talk a little bit about AoE rotation fundamentals. Really, the area of effect rotation for the Dragoon is sort of a nice and packaged 1, 2, 3 rotation. It's nothing too complex, but we're going to start off with Doom Spike, move into Sonic Thrust, and then end with Coercion Torment. A perk of Coercion Torment is that it also extends the duration of your Blood of the Dragon buff, meaning that you don't really need to worry too much about micromanaging it, which is super convenient because I don't want to micromanage that. Though I do wish that there was a way to either apply or re-extend the 10% damage buff from Disembowel in the AoE rotation, but generally speaking, I personally don't really bother to apply Disembowel during the AoE rotation, especially because it falls off, because I don't want to waste 2 global cooldowns getting a 10% damage buff when I could just simply have been mowing down the pack of mobs in AoE. But likewise, with this 1, 2, 3 rotation, we just weave in powerful off global cooldown abilities that the Dragoon has access to, and then go into their Life of the Dragon life cycle, and then use GEIRSKOGUL, Nestrond, and Stardivers, and you're going to do really great damage. So now that we've really covered the rotations in good depth, I want to talk about off global cooldown abilities and that kind of like go outside of the base rotation and really build off of it. And so let's start off with the Life Surge ability. Life Surge will guarantee a critical strike on the next weapon skill used. However, this means that only a weapon skill and not an ability, and so that's why I'm going to actually recommend you pair this Life Surge ability with the Full Thrust ability instead of Stardiver. People might be a little confused at this at first because they're like, oh, Stardiver is like our capstone ability, it deals the most, but Stardiver is an ability which is not a weapon skill. Some people new to the game might be like, what the heck does this mean? Basically, most off-global cooldowns are treated as abilities, most on-global cooldowns are called weapon skills or spells, and likewise the buff for Life Surge only impacts weapon skills, and so pair it with Full Thrust instead of Stardiver. I mean, you can't pair it with Stardiver, it'll just buff whatever you cast after Stardiver, but that generally just pair it with Full Thrust. Another thing that should be said is people might be like, oh, Chaos Thrust also has a massive damage over time effect, but unfortunately the skill Life Surge itself says that the effect cannot be applied to damage over time abilities, and so unfortunately again that would be really cool and deal a lot of damage if you could get every tick of that damage over time effect to crit, but that is not the world that we're in, and so don't try and pair that. So as a part of your rotation, I actually strongly recommend that you add Life Surge rate before True Thrust, as True Thrust is your current, at least at this patch, your current most powerful single target weapon skill at 530 potency, and so yeah, make sure you keep those two really lumped together. Next up is Piercing Talon, and this is your ranged ability on the global cooldown that you can spam from afar. This is very useful if there are certain mechanics that you need to dodge that would otherwise kill you. Always kind of like keep this ability handy. You'll be surprised how often you sometimes have to use it. Next up we have Lance Charge. I almost called this Blood for Blood, which was one of its old names, but basically this ability should be used whenever you're going to do in basically a heavy DPS phase, and we'll get into that in the rotation section when you kind of want to time this. And this is going to boost your damage by 15% for 20 seconds on a relatively short 90-second cooldown timer, which makes it align with a lot of raid buffs really nicely, and so this is extremely useful. You're going to get a whole lot of use out of it. Now we have entered the part of the Dragoons out of rotation abilities that I like to kind of consider all about movement and positioning, and in my opinion the Dragoon is really given a lot of tools for mobility which really shine in this section. So first off we have Elusive Jump, and this is going to flip you backwards from where you're currently facing, and this is actually one of my favorite abilities for both dodging mechanics as it's quick and direct, and with practice you can even use it, however, to initiate combat or move forward to targets, and on a relatively short 30-second cooldown timer this is absolutely a blast to use, and it makes Dragoon one of my favorite melee classes out of all of them because of its raw mobility potential just flipping around the battlefield. Now next up we have the Reverse, which we have an off global cooldown ability called Spine Shatter Dive. This does deal solid damage, and so it's going to definitely be a part of your damage rotation, but it's also going to position you right beside the target that you cast it on, kind of like how I said that Stardiver, well, this will do the exact same. But remember, like, your high jump or jump ability, as I'm just keeping it simple, is not going to position you, but this one will. So this is definitely something that you're going to want to remember for some mechanics on some boss fights, because it's like, okay, I jumped away, now I want to get closer, but how do you do it? Well, this is one of your options. And that leads into the next ability that functions for all intents and purposes basically the same. It does deal AoE damage and it has a bit more potency, but Dragonfire Dive basically acts the exact same. You are going to be able to use it to position yourself closer to target, and basically making your melee character very sticky. That's actually something that I have to say about the Dragoon, is that it's very sticky on targets, and that's definitely something that is very useful on a melee character. But yeah, in terms of Dragonfire Dive, very useful in single target and AoE rotations, especially AoE. You're gonna want to make sure that you don't forget this in your AoE. And so that wraps up that section. And so now we have the basics down on the rotation and core abilities. So I want to spend a little bit of time really fleshing out utility, because that's one of the major perks of what the Dragoon brings to the table. So the Dragoon brings forth extremely powerful party utility in the form of Dragon Sight and Battle Litany. But this begs the question of, okay, you say that, but how good are these buffs exactly? Because I feel that it's just kind of lame when you're just like, oh, this offers a lot of utility. Like, try and quantify what is a lot of utility. So if we look at FF logs for one of the top clearing groups of Titan Savage, their Battle Litany contributed a total of 740.8 damage on its own, and Dragon Sight gave a 180.6 buff, adding up to them both adding 921.4 DPS just from these two buffs alone. That's not even including the Dragoon's core damage. And if you're looking at Dragon Sight and you're just like, oh, that gives a self buff too, which we're going to get into a bit, we're actually only talking about the left eye buff here if you look at the screenshot. So that's only the buff that you're giving to someone else. And so try and keep that in mind when you're just like, oh, only 180 from your self buff in that? No, that's just a 5% buff on an ally. And little to say, this is actually quite impressive. So let's explain how these work, because Dragon Sight's actually a bit involved. So Dragon Sight will give you personally a 10% damage boost on yourself. This is, however, not what FF logs in the number above means. So you're given the so-called right eye, and the ally you buff is given the so-called left eye. So keep that in mind when you're checking any of these numbers. The number seen in FF logs is the left eye given to your ally you targeted with this buff, and that's the 5% DPS increase on them for as long as they are in range. And that is the key thing and most annoying part of this buff, is that you'll always have your own 10% damage boost from the buff, whether they're close to you, whether they're far. But if you target an ally that is super far away, then they will not get their 5% damage boost from it, so it kind of gets wasted, which is a shame. And you being melee and worried about positionals means you really don't get much say on if they run away from you or not. Generally, I'd say try and choose a target that's in melee range, ideally something heavy hitting that will represent your buff well, like Samurai. Or if you have a machinist or summoner nearby that actually understands what's going on, then buffing them and hoping that they stand near is pretty valid too. I've found myself not having too many issues this way, actually. I think that a lot of people really do understand, hey, I want this damage increase, and so I've found most people generally compromise. And if you're worried though about targeting an ally and then targeting the boss again and then casting the ability and all that, don't really worry about the micromanaging of this. I actually have macros in the tips and macros section, so don't worry about that. I swear it's not that hard to manage. And then the second buff, however, Battle Litany is significantly easier to understand, and that's just going to buff the entire party around yourself, giving them 10% increased critical hit chance on the press of a button for 20 seconds. No keeping target range or anything, just press and go, and it is extremely strong, as you saw before. And Dragoon being a melee DPS, you get access to all of the melee DPS role actions, and so let's kind of like prime over these. Second Wind is a quick burst of self-healing that can relieve pressure off of healers if you get hit by an AoE or some kind of mechanic. Say you stand in an orange circle, it really will help them out. Leg Sweep is a stun that is useful for stopping a target from casting something nasty. It's nice intentions for sure, but if I'm being honest, it's much less useful in raids because stuns don't impact most bosses. Any boss? I'll have to check that later, but as far as I can say right now off the top of my head, no boss can be stunned. Bloodbath is similar to Second Wind in that it will sustain you through damage, but it's over time and independent of really a burst phase, and it also is dependent on how much damage you're doing to a target. So if you use it, say, during your opener, it's going to be a ridiculously huge healing. And overall though, I have to say that this is one of my favorite role actions of all of the role actions, as it makes you significantly more durable during, say, AoE spam of bosses like Quietus. If you use this, you're probably going to be significantly higher in health than everyone else, because that's just boom AoE, boom AoE, and you're going to be like, oh, well, I used Bloodbath, yay. And if I'm being honest, it can help you recover, even in general content, from having a weaker healer that may not be giving you the attention that you deserve. I can even say that. But it's true. And next up is Feint, and that's an ability that I feel a bit torn on, and it will reduce one target's strength and dexterity by 10% for 10 seconds, and that is on a fairly low 90-second cooldown timer. But as I said, it's strength and dexterity, so it's like the physical side to the mage action of Adel. But this brings up the long debated question of what bosses actually use physical AoE or physical tank busters in raid situations. Sure, this can be nice to throw out during an AoE pull to help out the healer just on one boss, or I mean not a boss, but on like one mob that might hit hard. But in raids, I'd say that the best thing to really do with this ability is research into the particular fight and figure out where there is a powerful physical attack being done and throw feint onto the boss. But if I'm being super honest, too honest, I really don't know many melee DPS that ever use this ability. Too honest? Well, it's true. And then next up is the arm's length ability that prevents you from being knocked back, and that is awesome. It also does slow targets that hit you, so it can be nice for soloing, but outside of soloing, you really shouldn't be hit much. Unless a tank dies or something, but you really shouldn't be hit much. So mostly it is a knockback prevention tool. But next up is lastly and most absolutely critical for you as a positional based character is True North. Remember how we have a few positionals in our rotation? This ability allows us to wave away the positional requirements for 10 seconds. We can also store a total of 2 charges of this ability for a total duration of 20 seconds in a single burst. However, one charge does come back every 45 seconds, and so this ability I cannot overstate how useful it is, because if there are mechanics to prevent you from getting near the boss or from side to back, because some of these mechanics can get a bit wild, undeniably this is an ability that you're going to want to use a fair bit in my experience, and it totally does deserve a spot on your hotbars. So now that we've gone over all of the rotations, we've gone over the abilities, we've gone over the role actions with the Dragoon, putting all these pieces together, what exactly does the proper opener look like for the Dragoon? How can I really optimize this and really do the most damage that I can? So first off, the Dragoon is a bit different from some of the other classes that might want to invest more in skill speed or spell speed. Your melding priorities should be generally aimed to get the least skill speed possible, so you should be aiming for about 2.5. People on the Discord server personally recommend 2.49, and yeah, they crunch the numbers and they prove that that's most optimal, but generally speaking, you're gonna want to prioritize critical hit as your absolute number 1, followed by direct hit, and then determination. All of those are gonna increase your stats by varying amounts, and in order to basically maximize your ability's damage output when they do land, especially because as a Dragoon you have so many abilities off of the global cooldown, and we're going to talk a little bit about what I call animation locking. It's not a Realm Reborn animation locking for Dragoon anymore, but it definitely is something that I do encounter when I play it. And so this likewise also means with the stat priority that the food that I'd recommend is rogue lettuce salad, because it does offer a significant DPS increase by giving you a lot more critical hit and determination. A cheaper alternative, if you don't want to spend all that gil, is a high quality espresso con panna that is going to give you direct hit and crit. So without further ado, let's talk rotation. Before the pull, you're going to want to cast Blood the Dragon on yourself. Make sure that you have this ability up as often as you can. It should always be on you. And if you're using potions, pop one of those early on. Your rotation has a metric ton of off global cooldown abilities, and so just using the potion at the start is just better for the Dragoon, I find. I find that generally in the rotation for the Dragoon that you're not really going to have time with all your off global cooldowns to pop a potion, so I'd start off with it actually. And actually, that being said, I think that one major part of the Dragoon is managing your off global cooldowns effectively, because they do what I call animation lock. And yeah, if you've played during a Realm Reborn, you're going to be like, animation lock, not quite the same. And you're right, it's not the same, it's very different. But I've found some of the abilities are very difficult to double weave, and people might be like, well, double weaving is in general a little higher tier, a little bit more difficult, but I found with the Dragoon it can be absolutely difficult with some abilities, and that you're very likely to clip your global cooldown rotation if you don't use them properly. However, you're gonna start off with your Blood of the Dragon and your potion. From this, when the tank pulls, you aim to be behind the boss. You're going to start off with the behind positionals, and that's going to be where you're just going to plunk yourself during this entire first phase. You're going to lead in with True Thrust, immediately activate Eye of the Dragon onto your chosen ally, who will represent the buff the best to your team. Do not double weave this. In my opinion, I found myself having a little bit of animation weirdness. Now you're going to move into Disembowel and apply the 10% damage buff to yourself. And then after casting Disembowel, you're going to immediately follow up with a double weave of Battle Litany and Lance Charge, providing out all of your ability utility during this massive DPS burst window. And I'm going to actually reference this image from my Summoner guide. Credits go to the authors, of course. And so this is just to give you a general idea of where you fit into this entire buff window. And so the buff window really starts around your 3rd global cooldown, and this is a big part of why you time these buffs the way that you do, and you don't just pop it immediately, because your buffs can stack with other buffs, and they just kind of multiply with one another, and so you get a really big burst. And so now you apply your opponent damage over time effect with the Chaos Thrust ability, following up by starting your 1-minute cycle of the Dragon life cycles by finally executing Jump. Again, at this point, I warn you off of double weaving because of animations. And likewise, I should say, with Mirage Dive, you do have a fairly decent window of duration of when you can cast it after Jump. The main thing is you don't worry so much about when you weave in Mirage Dive, because you have so much flexibility with that. You can later on, especially after the opener, you can basically throw it whenever you actually have like a full open global cooldown between one global cooldown and the next one, and so don't really feel rushed to do that. So I've personally found that if you jump and then try and double weave Mirage Dive, that sometimes you really get clipping. So I personally recommend, if you don't need to do it, don't do it. Now comes a little bit of the tricky part. Follow up with Wheeling Thrust from behind. And as I said, this might get a bit tricky to get the hang of, but just practice it with just take a training dummy, go over the tips and tricks sections with positionals, and kind of practice this part. I found that this is the part that when I've tried to teach people, they really struggle with the most. So what you're going to do is Wheeling Thrust off the global cooldown. You're going to use Spine Shatter Dive here, and you really do want to use that because its damage is very significant. Some people might be like, well, if it's really difficult, why bother? But it does pay off, especially because you have all of those buffs from that buff life cycle going on. So make sure that you try and fit this in. One thing about Spine Shatter Dive and why you'd want to put it here is that it doesn't put you back in your original position like a normal jump or high jump. Basically, it will allow you to get closer to the boss and continue to move. And so, yeah, basically just practice it. I know that some people will probably struggle, but I swear it's worth it. And then the next thing is, as you go from this phase, you basically need to maneuver to the side of whatever your target is, and now you enter the Christian side hug part of the rotation. You then use Fang and Claw from the side of the boss and can continue to keep generally to the side. Weave in your GEIRSKOGUL ability, and this should allow it to come off of cooldown by the time that you get your second Mirage Dive cast. And actually the timing of the GEIRSKOGUL ability is very important, because I noticed myself before I really caught on was that I would use the GEIRSKOGUL ability and then I would unlock full open Eye of the Dragon, and so basically that would lock me out of using Nastrond and Stardiver for a prolonged period of time. It's not the end of the world, but still kind of try and keep it timed about here, because by the time you have that second Mirage Dive cast and the eye fully open, you're going to have the ability open to get into that life cycle. So just something to note, but it's not too major, it's not the end of the world, but definitely something to note. At this point, you should ideally have Ride and Thrust open, cast Ride and Thrust, and then follow up with Dragonfire Dive off the global cooldown. Now cast Horrible Thrust, and then immediately cast Life Surge. I don't know why, but of all the off global cooldown animations I struggle with, this is probably the worst for me. You're gonna see that I use it in a macro. I've tried it macro, I've tried it off macro. I don't know why, but this ability I have found I have the worst animation lock. So in my experience, cast this ASAP. Like, I'd even mash that button for a Life Surge and just make sure that you get it off quick. And then you're gonna follow up with your Life Surge guaranteed crit of True Thrust, dealing tons of damage. And then finally, because you have a Mirage Dive that's on wait, and because it has so much leniency with that duration of the when you can cast it, you're going to finally cast Mirage Dive off of the global cooldown. Now you're going to close this loop, following up with Fang and Claw into Wheeling Thrust, and adjust your positioning from the side to now be behind the target. Then you're going to follow up with the backside rotation. And kind of from this point onwards, you just maintain this rotation, pivoting from behind to beside the boss between Fang and Claw and Wheeling Thrust. Those two abilities should be your main, oh, I need to pivot position notifications. And likewise, you can always keep track of where you should be. If your current rotation is on the bottom hotbars, then you know you should have to be behind the boss. If they are to the top bars, then you know that you should be adjusting yourself to the side. And then from this point forward, you should also be casting off global cooldown abilities as they come off, jump when it's available, spine shatter dive, and so on. So when you enter your life cycle where you hit Life of the Dragon, open up with GEIRSKOGUL, and follow up with Nestron though, you're going to weave in your off global cooldown abilities between global cooldowns just the same as before. Just be aware that you should be getting at least one Nestron off every 10 seconds for this 30-second phase, or kind of between 3-ish, 4-ish global cooldowns. You should be like, oh, I'm switching from side to back, that's been about 4 global cooldowns, I should probably cast Nestron. Generally that's where my mentality is at when I'm doing it, but just don't be caught only doing 1 or 2 Nestrons, or I guess even worse, none. Try and always aim for 3. From this point though, it's really just rinse and repeat. There's gonna be nothing fancy. Like if you watched my summoner guide video, basically you can just continue from here on and just make sure as soon as something comes off you use it. Your cooldowns should generally align with other raid buffs as you use them, basically as soon as they're off cooldown. Generally people tend to align their buffs in 30-second increments, so 60, 90, 120 seconds, and so using them off of cooldown at this point is more than appropriate. Likewise, continuing to use jump off of cooldown should align it with raid buffs because of its 30-second cooldown timer too. Mirage Dive, just throw in whenever, but generally speaking, jump just use off cooldown. Now, let's talk area of effect rotation. AoE rotations are always a bit trickier to theorycraft and talk about, because what exactly is optimal in dungeons? It's just kind of, you sort of piece together what you have off cooldown the best that you can and make it work. A theoretical AoE rotation in an ideal world though could be something like this though. You start off with foods, potions, and applying the Blood of the Dragon buff to yourself, then you use Doom Spike and lead into Lance Charge and Battle Litany. Follow up with Sonic Thrust into Eye of the Dragon, and then Coerth and Torment, followed by Dragonfire Dive. Restart the 1-2-3 rotation, casting Doom Spike into GEIRSKOGUL, and then Dive, Sonic Thrust into Mirage Dive. Now at this point you should just continue to really do that 1-2-3 rotation, weaving in off global cooldowns whenever you can. Use Bloodbath if you take chip damage from the AoE mobs, and just pop into Life of the Dragon cycle whenever, and use Stardive or Nestron when you can. And now let's talk about handy macros and tips and tricks that I've kind of found are really helpful for me. First tip and trick is one that I've noticed that a lot of newer players do not realize until it's said, and then they're like, oh. And that's that the back position of the boss, or whatever you're targeting, and the side position is actually indicated by the circle on the ground around the boss's location, which if you see the circle, you can see this part of the circle that's kind of broken, right? This indicates the back of the boss, this broken circle part. The sides are indicated by the parts of the circle that actually have lines, so if you're really worried about fully moving to the side or behind the boss, just stand in between the broken part of the circle and the filled in line part, and you can just walk like a pixel or so really between them, and just weave between them. And you don't need to literally be directly at the side of the boss for positionals. As I was trying to teach and show people, some of them were like moving way to the side and they're like, oh my god, this is stressful, and I'm like, yeah, that is. Just stand near this nice little intersection and tiptoe around it when needed. And of course, when needed, use the true north roll action whenever you're struggling or need to get out of a mechanic, but I've found that this helps a lot of new players a tremendously large amount. I was actually shocked that more people didn't know this, so definitely take note of the circle. It'll be a great guide, and you'll always have it, so yeah, just get used to that, and I swear that the positions become really easy. Eye of the Dragon buff, macro. Buff macro. Whoops. and generally speaking, I move around the party list a lot, especially as a DPS. I can just move the party list around and kind of make it a mess and forget it. So I move the best partner to slot 4, second best to slot 2, and third best to slot 3. Sort of strange ordering, but that's what I do. And then I just press the macro button semi-mindlessly and go about doing my rotation, not really caring about targeting manually a party member, pressing the buff and then pressing tab to get to the back of the boss. Or what if party member 4 is out of range? So this macro kind of like covers all those situations, because no one, I don't think many people really find it fun to tab onto the boss, tab onto an ally, cast your buff, and then go back. Let's just keep it simple. So with all that said, we are finally done covering the guide on the Dragoon. Now I'm going to talk about my personal experiences playing it and my personal lists of pros and cons and who I'd really recommend the Dragoon for. Starting with the pros, when people say that they really want a faster paced playstyle, the Dragoon instantly comes to mind for me, because they have the core rotation, which yes, it's on a 2.5 second global cooldown, and as I said, you don't really want to use tons of skill speed, but you are weaving in so many off-global cooldowns with its off-global cooldown rotations with Jump and Mirage Dive and GEIRSKOGUL into Nestrond and to Stardiver and so many others that it's still a fairly rapid pace, and that I feel that even if you're really hesitant about coming to Final Fantasy XIV because of the longer global cooldown, that the Dragoon can offer an extremely engaging and fun faster paced style of play. Next up, I need to mention that the Dragoon's buffs are strong, very strong. Just look at the FF Logs numbers from before. For buffs, that's actually really good. And if buffing allies makes you excited, then you'll be more than pleased with the Dragoon. While it's not the dancer that invests so much of its kit into buffs, it sure as heck brings a metric ton of utility of its own. If you like buffs and playing melee, the Dragoon is the first job that comes to my mind. Next up, I kind of find that the Dragoon would be my personal #1 pick for melee DPS that I'd recommend to newer players. Not because it's easy, because it's not. I don't want to say that, because no, and that Master Dragoon players definitely have invested a lot of time, effort, and skill. But because unlike the monk, I find that once you understand the goals and the basic rotation, that it does become very clear when and what to do, and most critically, why. It's not like the summoner, where developing an intuition of timing and what, when, where will make or break you, or where you have Phoenix come off a cooldown and then you're just like, oh, why am I not just mashing the button? Oh, because it breaks everything. Well, and so basically, also, you don't need to monitor like 1,000 different things. Talking about the summoner and comparing it to the Dragoon, yeah, you need to monitor some stuff on the Dragoon, but it's not like, holy crap, I've basically entered like a flight simulator where I have like a gauge, a full flight control panel of things, and I'm like, oh god, what goes where? And another thing is that I find positionals on the Dragoon nice and clear. Just through their rotation, how I handle it with the hotbars, I find it very intuitive. Simply put, with the way I lay out my hotbars, I know where I'm meant to be at any given point of the fight. Whereas coming from playing Monk, I've found Monk positionals in comparison to be all over the place. I'm the first to say that I'm not the best Monk, but even going through their proper rotation, I'm like, ugh, that's a bit more over the place than Dragoon. Next up, I find that in terms of mobility, that the Dragoon is insanely loaded with mobility, and it's really cool and fun to use their mobility too. You can jump away from bosses, you can leap around using Spine Shadow Dive into Dragonfire Dive into Stardiver, and basically you're almost always in the right position at the right time with the Dragoon, and you're very sticky. Next up, I find the Dragoon's AoE rotation fairly engaging actually. I know people are going to be like, a basic 1, 2, 3, and yeah, basic 1, 2, 3 might not be much on its own, but when you involve GEIRSKOGUL, Dragonfire Dive, Nestrond, and Stardiver into the mix, it does actually become really fun for me. And likewise, a guide that I did on my personal impressions could not be done without cons. First off, I really wish that the AoE rotation had some kind of mechanic built into it that would just naturally boost the duration of Disembowel 10% damage buff, like it does with Blood the Dragon. Just a basic quality of life thing, nothing too major, but right now, I really wish that I had that. That'd be nice. Next off, as a con, I have to say that the global cooldown clipping is a big thing. Not just a thing, but a big thing. Managing your off-global cooldowns is undeniably a challenge that every single Dragoon player will face. And likewise, that's why I said before that I don't say that the Dragoon's easy, because it's not. It definitely faces a very different challenge from other classes. And so really, a Master Dragoon will know, oh, this is about this duration to this duration. I know that I can leave this and this alongside this, or what if I'm away from the boss? Like, they know what they're doing. It definitely takes a fairly good amount of skill, but you generally know with a Dragoon what your end goal is and when you should be using things. Lastly, as a third con, is that I'd say with any class that brings utility or buffs to the party for damage, that the Dragoon has slightly lower personal DPS than other jobs like the Samurai that brings no utility, meaning that teammates will represent your buffs poorly if they do poorly, and likewise lower your personal contributions a bit. Great teammates, however, will represent it greatly and actually bring you up even further. But by no means is the Dragoon weak. Pulling off FF logs, the Dragoon is sitting at very comfortable 4th position, 4th highest DPS on the 75th percentile of Titan Savage this patch, sitting at 13,984.53 DPS, whereas the absolute top dog that I was talking about earlier, which is Samurai, and it's a monster right now, is at 14,373.38 DPS. And if I'm being honest, that's really not a huge difference at all. So when I say this is a con, it is such a slight con that I feel like I'm pulling at strings for this one. It's not like Dancer where you are literally made or broken by how your team does. But yeah, I feel like I'm kind of pulling at strings on this one. Reality is that when it comes to these cons, they aren't major and that they're more than manageable. I'd easily recommend the Dragoon to literally anyone. And I guess that really gives away my next section, which is kind of my thoughts on the Dragoon as a whole. I really love it. I love the mobility with the backflips, I love jumping onto enemies, I love the buffs for allies, and feeling like I'm wanted and welcome addition to the team while bringing the theme of dragons fully into the game. And it's just something that I'm very much a fan of. It just all meshes together and really makes me happy to play. I love weaving in the off-global cooldowns for very different but faster pace of gameplay. I love moving in from GEIRSKOGUL to Nastrand and blowing away packs of mobs and raid bosses alike. I can say with no hesitation that the Dragoon is an enjoyable experience and one that I'd recommend to anyone looking at Final Fantasy XIV or considering an alternative job. Maybe you have never played melee DPS, but for sure I can say that if you're looking at a rewarding job that has a solid sense of direction and gameplay and intuition, that the Dragoon is more than fantastic and you will definitely feel at home on it. So with all that said, what are your thoughts on the Dragoon? Have you tried it yet? Or maybe you're just looking at trying it as your first melee DPS? Let me know in the comment section down below. And I make sure to read all my comments, and I really do love to hear everyone's experiences. Anyhow, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and of course any likes and subscribes are totally appreciated. Well, thank you so much. Have a great one.